I'm Margaret Winslow, Curator of Contemporary Art at the Delaware Art Museum, and this is Artwatch on WCHE 1520 AM, live every Wednesday from 1 to 1:30. Joining me on the air is Paul Sacaridiz, Executive Director of Haystack Mountain School of Crafts on Deer Isle, Maine. Paul served as juror for the Delaware Art Museum's Fall 2018 Juried Craft Exhibition. After the break, we'll hear from Linda Celestian, whose work is included in the show. Paul, thank you for joining us, and thank you for serving as juror for the museum's Juried Craft Show.
My pleasure.
So, Paul, you had the wonderfully challenging and I suspect very fun task of selecting 61 objects by 39 artists. Tell us a bit about that process and what you kept in mind when making your selections.
Sure. It's always an interesting process to go through these sorts of juries, or really for any sort of process of selecting work for an exhibition. I think that we had around 300 or 350 submissions total for the show, and so the activity of trying to kind of whittle that down to the number of objects that we needed to make the show was it's not a process, I would say, that you start with a clear, exact idea of what you're after, as much as you begin looking at the work. And I sifted through it multiple times just by looking at all of the entries. And then in some process, I started kind of categorizing them and thinking about works that fit into certain genres and certain approaches. And then based on that, began kind of whittling off the works that I thought were the most compelling, and also the works that would kind of have a conversation with one another. And the hardest part of these processes is that within the total number of entries, we probably could have made 3 different shows. And there was so much good work to be selected from. And but in the end, you have to make some hard choices. And so I felt like the work we selected, or that I selected rather, was work that was really compelling and work that interacted with one another in a way that was sometimes logical and sometimes illogical and surprising. And so hopefully people who see the show will think about that a bit.
Well, and I think, your selections just make that diversity so visible within the exhibition itself. And as the curator who then has the fun task of installing the works of art, it was wonderful to be able to see some of those connections that I felt you must have seen, some of those logical connections, find ways for those compelling conversations to happen within the gallery space, and then find other places where there's a kind of interesting tension between objects. So that was the fun work that then I get to do in the gallery space.
Yeah, in a way, my job was probably the easy one, right? Like it was my job to make the selections, and then I was very much aware that it would be your job and the job of the staff at the museum to think about how does this lay out, and how does one thing sit next to another, and how does a conversation between 2 things take place. And I think that's a tremendous skill set in the work of actually laying out the show proper. So yeah, that's definitely a collaborative effort in the end.
Of course, yeah, and a fun one. So you mentioned, you see, and I do a similar, kind of go through a similar process when I'm during exhibitions as well, too, because you're working with a number of works that have been proposed for consideration. So within those, I think, it's fun to start pulling out those genres or different approaches. And as we think about kind of the field of contemporary craft today, what are you seeing, or what have you seen even in this exhibition? Some of these new developments, approaches, and genres.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would back up slightly and say that one of the other things I was very aware of in trying to make the selections for this show, being aware of my own bias and trying to make sure that the work I selected was not only in one sort of approach to the field of craft, because in fact it's such a multifaceted and inclusive field right now in particular. And so what I think when I look at the field broadly, there's been tremendous changes in the past, let's say the past 15 years, and even in the past 10 to 5 years, I think there's been significant changes taking place. And one of the things that I love about thinking about the field of craft is that it's not static. And there are ways in which we have historically understood things that have been categorized under the umbrella that we've called craft. And historically, they would have been materials and processes that were very specific, and they would have most traditionally been things made out of wood, glass, clay, metal, and fiber. And that's really a history that comes out of the Bauhaus tradition in Europe. It's one that comes over to the United States. It's one that gets ingrained into educational systems and exhibitions and museums, and begins to move into galleries. It begins to be purchased by collectors, and suddenly there's this whole ecosystem that now is kind of swirling around this idea of craft. And for a long time, that work and the way in which we've kind of thought about value systems was very much based on skill, and it was based on mastery, and it was based on people who would dedicate their lives to one single pursuit in one single material. And in some ways, in this day and age, that seems almost anachronistic when artists are frequently working in very diverse ways, and that the work of the artist is to think about a question that they want to ask, and then often to think about the material that best kind of illustrates that or allows them to think through those things materially. And so the idea of saying that for your entire life you're going to commit to one material and ask all your questions through that is actually, I think, a profoundly deep and interesting approach. The challenge is it's no longer the single way in which people who identify with craft-based materials and traditions work. People are now, just thinking so expansively, but at the same time, they're also thinking very deeply still in one material and in one way of working. And so, kind of holding two contradictory approaches at the same time. One is saying there's dedication to singularity of material, and the other is saying, the doors have been kind of blown wide open, and suddenly there's a lot of ways to work. And so I think in recent years we've seen those shifts, and we've seen artists who are increasingly fluent and versatile in the language of contemporary design, in the language of contemporary art, and within the approach of social practice and community-based engagement, and ways of thinking about the work of the artist as being not only concerned with making an object, but concerned with kind of changing a culture. And that has had profound ramifications on the things that are being made right now. And what I love most about the moment that we're in, I think, with this field is that, for a number of years, I felt like there was a backlash where the idea of making a beautiful object was seen as somehow superfluous to the problems of the world. And I think we're in a time when there seems to be the acknowledgement and space for all of it. For someone to go out and have a very radical practice that is politically, socially engaged, and also to say that there's tremendous value in making a really beautiful handmade object that can enter someone's private life in their home and to help them think about things in a very intimate, close way. And so I think it's an exciting time, and it's a complicated time as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I think, I mean, you've described that so beautifully. And I think it's fascinating to see how various communities, institutions, whether it be an institution of higher learning or a non-collecting or collecting contemporary art space or visual art space, how that is accepted. I take us back historically to a quote that I found from a speaker at the Delaware Art Museum's first craft show. So we had our first in 1950. 58, 60 years ago, and that really started this tradition for the museum presenting annual juried shows. Now, that speaker was Thomas S. Tibbs, who was then the director of the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, which is now the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. And he was calling, and I thought this was just so interesting, and I'm sure it's come up again and again, calling for the breakdown of the barriers between the, and I'm quoting, so-called fine arts and the work of artists, craftsmen. As this incredibly interdisciplinary approach and engagement of materials and process on a variety of different levels is happening, have those barriers been broken? Will this continue to be a kind of ongoing conversation?
I suppose if you can come up with the answer to that, you'll have seen the future.
I know, right? It's like that and the death of painting. When will painting die or be reborn?
Yeah, painting's died so many times.
So many.
It's not even funny.
Yeah.
That quote, I was struck by that as well, the quote that you just read. And I suppose one of the things I find really interesting is that it points to the fact that this question has kind of always been on the periphery of this kind of subfield of the art world. And so I guess the question, like all good questions, they're probably always being re-asked and reframed in new ways, and that's what helps us to understand what we're doing is having a counterpoint to something. And I would hope that actually the very idea of craft doesn't get subsumed under just becoming quote-unquote contemporary art, because I would actually argue that they're they're related, but they're different things, and they're different mostly in terms of the history that they speak to and that they come out of, and that we kind of hold dear in a way, and they're the questions that keep us up at night. And so I think that the biggest danger of saying that question's been, that the doors have been blown open and that it's kind of all one now. The danger there is that we also have a risk losing a history. We lose a history of makers. We lose a history of materials. We lose a history of traditions that have actually never been very well documented in the first place. And the history of craft is actually being written now in some ways for the first time. And there's incredible scholarship taking place, and there's incredible work to look at traditions that for many, many years were disregarded, specifically the work of women in the field of craft, that until recent times, it was seen as this historical moment that was kind of put off to the side. And now it's being, those books are being taken off the shelf and kind of dusted off and looked at in very new ways. And I think it's incredibly exciting. But I suppose to answer your initial question, have we seen this all come together? I suppose in some ways we have. I think that we're no longer fighting the art-craft divide in the same ways that those debates were being argued before. And I think that there's much more room for complexity and gray area than there ever has been. And I think that that's a very positive thing.
And very exciting. And tell me briefly, Paul, how do you see the work of, an institution like you're with, Haysock Mountain School of Crafts, or other, I see sometimes new programs or redesigned programs at colleges and universities. How do you think that they are supporting that work? Are there kind of great examples? I think of Critical Craft Forum, which I follow on Facebook. Like, it seems like, what are some of these other great places that are supporting this kind of work today?
I think, honestly, for those of us who are administering and running programs and who are dedicated to this kind of work, I do believe that we're helping to advance the understanding and thinking of it. And so for an institution like Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, where I am, our school's been in existence since 1950. And in many ways, the school has kind of followed the trajectory of this field for a long time, one of our biggest jobs is to make sure that we're being really inclusive in our programming, to make sure that we're bringing in artists and thinkers who are deeply invested in the tradition and legacy of the field, and that we're also bringing in people who are kind of pushing at the edges of it to make us think a little differently about how we understand the things in which we're doing. And there's tremendous work being done right now through academic programs. There's a brand new program that just launched this year, and it's the first MA in critical craft studies of its kind in the United States, and it's being run out of Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. And it literally is the first program that will be training a generation of dedicated craft historians. And this is it's significant, and this is being run by Namita Gupta-Wiggers, who's also the founder of Critical Craft Forum.
Oh, and that's exciting. Paul, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I'd encourage our listeners to come to the museum, the Delaware Art Museum, this Saturday, the 20th, to hear more from Paul Sacaridiz at 2 p.m. Paul, thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome back to Artwatch. This is Margaret Winslow, and for those of you just tuning in, we're discussing the Delaware Art Museum's Fall Juried Craft Exhibition, which opens to the public this Saturday, October 20th. Joining me on the air is Linda Celestian, one of the artists participating in the show. Linda, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, Linda, you have, I admit, I've known you and your work for a bit of time now, and I'm so excited that you have 3 works included in the Juried Craft Exhibition. All are from 2016, and all are made from silks, woods, dyes. Tell us a bit about these 3 pieces and your work in textile.
So my work in textile involves Nuno felting, which a lot of people don't really know what that term is. I'm combining wool with silk to create a new fabric. And then I'm dyeing it, stitching it into forms, and some of them are suspended. There is one wall piece. But I sort of got into that because I went to school for fashion design. And then I also work in painting and create paintings. But I encountered an artist that was working in silk, and it sort of brought me back to my roots, which was my mother sewed all my clothes when I was a child, and I was constantly sewing for myself. So when I discovered silk and that I could sculpt with it, and these aren't stuffed sculptures, they're suspended, so they're light and airy and colorful. So I don't know, I just discovered this whole new world where I could use my pattern making skills that I had learned from college, my color skills that I had learned from painting, and sort of meld it all into one world. And Linda, so that's what they're made out of.
Oh, and they're just beautiful in the space. I mean, there's this wonderful tension between a kind of light, airy, and of course helped by that by being installed with fishing lines, so they appear suspended, they appear to floating, but they have this wonderful weight to them too. So it's kind of, this isn't a great connection between like one of those, like a cumulus cloud, but it is that kind of, this beautiful suspension but weight simultaneously, and I think the way they occupy the space is just incredibly impactful for the viewer.
Thank you.
And so, Linda, tell us a bit about this particular felting technique that you mentioned. So it's uncommon for wool and silk to be felted together? And how did you, is that true? And 2, how did you come across combining these 2 fibers?
I think that it is actually a fairly new process from my research. I just stumbled into it in 2 different ways. My sister had taken a workshop with a silk scarf and, the wool, and then I met another artist who was felting. But I had my sister teach me this process, which is laying the fibers over the silk, and then you add warm, soapy water and agitation, like when you shrink your wool sweater in the wash.
Yes, by accident, yeah.
Yeah, well, the wool fibers work their way through the silk, and then the wool shrinks. And then you also do another process of throwing the piece on the table with force, which shrinks the wool even more, which gathers the silk and puckers the silk. So in placing the wool strategically, you're creating gathering or puckering in the piece. So sometimes I just create a fabric that then I sew the forms with. Other times I'm using the wool very strategically to create the form itself. So that's just fascinating to me, and I feel like I'm just starting to discover what can be done with it. So I just have so many more ideas of different ways to use it. So that's exciting to me.
I would imagine now, listening to this description, as you're giving it, I'm, of course, thinking like, wow, it would be wonderful to have the opportunity to do this with you. And I'm just so glad that the Delaware Art Museum has planned a felted scarves workshop with you on Sunday, November 18th. Can you tell us a bit about what the workshop participants will be doing?
Well, we're going to make a scarf that's Nuno felted, but it's really fun to share the process because it's kind of surprising when it actually, the end product, the puckering, you can cause ruffles on the edge of a silk scarf. It still stays very lightweight, so it's not a heavy piece to be worn. Has a lot of movement. You're able to play with color. So it's a pretty exciting process and very fun to share.
Yes.
So I'm excited about it as well.
That will be wonderful. Now, as you were saying a bit, your creative practice extends beyond just working with fiber. You have a painting practice as well. What are some of the common interests, kind of threads of inquiry that are woven throughout all of these different parts of your creative practice?
I think the common thread is nature. So even in my paintings, I'm interested in natural process, and I thin down the paint and I pour it and let it puddle and let it dry. And sometimes I put additives in to create some kind of process that will happen, like turpentine dropped into wet acrylic paint will create holes in the paint, or I'll drop dust of sawdust or a mineral. I'm thinking of glitter or whatever, and it will dry, and a natural occurring markings will happen in the paint. So I'm always trying to play with that. I say that I'm in partnership with the laws of nature. So I just sort of play with the paint and let it do what it's going to do. And I'm in charge of composition and editing and all that. But it inspires me to see kind of how they mimic things that you'll find on nature hikes, like ice on a puddle, dirt that's dried, like a dried waterbed, and the cracks that appear. So I'm just fascinated with how I can play with that. So in the silk, I even use rusty objects to dye the silk. So rust being a natural occurring process that happens. And even just what happens when I'm not using rust, I dye the silk. I just call it puddle dyeing. So I pour the dye very watered down on the silk and then let it evaporate, and it creates this really interesting patterns. Similar to shibori dyeing, but I'm not controlling it. I'm just letting nature, the evaporation process, cause these markings. So I think that's my common thread, and that goes back to my childhood. My father was in love with being on the water and boating. So instead of leaving us at home, he packed us up and we spent our summers on our boat. So it was a great childhood. I have two sisters, and we just ran around in our bathing suits all summer long, but we were in nature literally every day, and that's carried over into my artwork.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like there's a wonderful, so you, I think, use the phrase natural process, how you're engaging with that. It sounds like, also engaging with the unexpected, with chance, kind of following what materials and processes, how will they evolve in the studio. And I love the comparison then to natural forms and that wonderful tension between the unexpected that we might see in nature and how that can be in some cases replicated.
The beauty of it too.
Yeah.
So one of the things I love is fungus. The way that it grows and the shapes and patterns and colors. So constantly stopping in my tracks to take a picture of tree fungus, and there's so many different kinds. So some of the silk forms are based on that, or coral. Just paying attention to nature and then kind of playing with it in the studio.
Now, Linda, I know, so you'll be in the Juried, you are in the Juried Craft exhibition at the Delaware Art Museum, which runs through January, but you're also in a two-person exhibition coming up at the Delaware Contemporary, which is opening in November. What will our listeners see in that exhibition at the Delaware Contemporary?
So I'm very excited because I'm showing paintings and sculpture. So given the opportunity in the space, I decided to design a new sculpture that I've been working on for months. So in designing a new sculpture, I might make a little piece that kind of sets the direction, but then I really don't know what this large multi-component suspended sculpture will look like until I'm done. So I'm working out some things in the studio right now, hanging it from the ceiling and playing with where does it need wire, where does it need this or that. But it's sort of like having a baby. I don't really know exactly how it's going to turn out until I see it installed. So that I'm really excited about. And also, like I said, being able to see hopefully a dialogue between the two-dimensional paintings and the three-dimensional pieces, because they definitely inspire each other.
And what a wonderful opportunity for visitors to be able to see kind of multiple parts of your creative practice. Linda, thank you so much for joining us on Artwatch. So
My pleasure.
A rich program of gallery talks, artist demonstrations, and workshops have been planned to complement the Juried Craft exhibition at the Delaware Art Museum. Please visit the museum's website at delart.org to find the many opportunities to learn more about craft today. The Delaware Art Museum is not the only local institution celebrating contemporary craft this fall. The museum is partnering with Hagley Museum to offer visitors a special deal this Saturday, October 20th. Buy a ticket at either museum for admission to both the Delaware Art Museum's Juried Craft exhibition and the Hagley Craft Fair. Also, don't miss the last chance to see natural wonders, the sublime and contemporary art, at the Brandywine River Museum of Art. This stunning exhibition closes this Sunday, October 21st, and a few weeks remain to see Fusion, an exhibition of large-scale paintings by Alan C. Smith and sand and glass installations by Connie Zare at the Delaware Contemporary. It is a brilliant show. This is Margaret Winslow. Thank you for joining us today on Artwatch, and thank you to my guests, Paul Sacaridiz and Linda Celestian. Next week, tune in to hear Rebecca Moore of Somerville Manning Gallery speak with exhibiting artist Michael Doyle. For audio podcasts of this and other Artwatch radio shows, visit lilygaller.com and click on Artwatch Radio, or chadsfordlive.com under Arts and Entertainment. Tune in every Wednesday from 1 to 1:30 p.m. live in the studio of Westchester's own WCHE 1520 AM as we discuss art of the greater Brandywine Valley region.